As a next step, we might want to gather the weight and height inputs. And for that, I'll add another new function, maybe in that same file or in a different file. The input.go file might be a suitable file given its name, which is part of the main package though, and that's fine. We could also turn it into a separate package, but I'll keep it as part of the main package. And in there, I'll add a new function which I'll name getUserMetrics. Again, the name is up to you, but you should describe what the function does, and this function should deal with fetching the user weight and height inputs. So that should be a good name. And for this function, I don't expect any parameters, but we'll have return values, and actually we'll have more than one return value. We'll have a weight and a height. So we will return two values, and therefore we have to specify those return values here, or their types to be precise. You learned that if it's more than one return value, we have to wrap the list of return value types in parentheses here, and that's therefore what I'll add. And then we have our curly braces with the function body. But which return value types will we have in getUserMetrics now? Well, that is up to you. We could return the fetched weight input and height input strings, and then continue with cleaning them and so on in the next steps in the main function. Or we could argue that actually the getUserMetrics function should already do the cleaning for us and should therefore return the floats in the end. And that argument would make sense to me, that getUserMetrics should return floats and not just the raw user input. And therefore I'll return two float64 values here. And then inside of getUserMetrics, I'll execute this code here. So I'll cut that code from bmi.go and add it here in input.go. But of course, for that to work, we need to make sure that we again import format and info here. So I'll click on format, go to the light bulb and add the format import, and do the same for info. So that's now also imported. Now I then get my weight and height input, and then I can return those values, though we first of all have to clean them. So we can go back to bmi.go, remove those comments, and grab those lines of code where we clean the input and parse the float from the input text, and cut that from bmi.go as well, and go back to input.go and add it here in getUserMetrics. And then here we do all that cleaning and parsing, and we should therefore import those packages, strings and strconf, like that. And then ultimately at the end, here at the bottom, we can return weight and height like this. Alternatively, we could work with named return values and name this weight and height here when we define the return value types, like this. And then we don't create new variables here, but instead we assign to existing variables like this. And we can just call return like this and automatically the named return values, so these two variables, will be returned. Both works, and it's up to you which approach you prefer. Now with that, back in bmi.go, we just have to call getUserMetrics. We don't need to import that from a package or call that on a package, since it's part of the same main package here. So just calling it like this is fine, and starting with a lowercase character is fine since it's the same package. And then we just have to create weight and height here and store the returned values in those variables. Whoops, like that. And here we need the := operator, because here in the main function we are creating brand new variables. We didn't have those variables before. And with this, if we save that, imports should get cleaned up automatically as soon as we save. We can try running this again, and it should still work fine. And it does. But now we added a couple of custom functions. Still, we can do more. We definitely did split up our code quite a bit, but still we're doing more than one thing in main. We have different levels of abstraction here, as it's called. We're calling some functions, and then we're all of a sudden doing some low-level calculations. We typically want to avoid that. And in input.go, that getUserMetrics function is also still rather big. We could make an argument for breaking that up even more as well. And I want to do both. Make BMI.go simpler and break up the getUserMetrics function more. Now I'll start with BMI.go. And first of all, I want to outsource this formula. Here I'll create a function in the same file, since it makes sense to have the formula for calculating the body mass index in the file called BMI.go, I would say. So here I'll add a new func and name it calculate BMI, because that's what we're doing. And I expect to get two input values here. Weight and height. We need that in order to derive the body mass index. So here I'll add weight and height as parameters. The names are up to you though. They don't have to match the variable names up there, because we won't have access to those variables in this function anyways. So these names are really totally up to you. But weight and height describe pretty well what will be stored in there. And we definitely do have to define the value types of those parameters. And here I expect to get float 64 values, so I'll add those type names after the parameter names. And then we can grab that formula, cut it, and instead just return it here. Using weight and height, like this, and making it clear that calculate BMI will return a float 64 therefore by adding float 64 as a return value type after the function name and parameter list. Now here back in main, we can just call calculate BMI and pass in weight and height like that. And now I'll also remove the comments to make this all a bit more concise and shorter. So now we outsourced this into this function, and the advantage, as mentioned before, would be that if we would call calculate BMI in different parts of the application, and we ever want to change this formula, we only have to do it once inside of that function definition, instead of having to go into different places in our code and adjusting the formula in all those places manually. This can save you a lot of time as your application grows. Now, as a next step, I also want to outsource this line of code here, line 16, and put that into a separate function. We could do that here in the BMI.go file, but where calculate BMI made a lot of sense to reside in a file named BMI.go, just printing some output could possibly also go into another file. Though of course we could also add the function here. You can always have a discussion about that, and it always comes down to personal preferences. But since we have an input.go file, I'll also add an output.go file here, which should be responsible for outputting the results of our calculation. And I'll add that to the main package as well. But in there, I'll add my function called print BMI. And I expect to get the BMI as a input, as a parameter, and it should be of type float64. And then that code, which we have in BMI.go, this line of code will be extracted from there, will be removed from the main function, and instead will be added into this print BMI function. Here we now just again have to add the import of the format package. And with that back in BMI.go, here in the main function, we can just call print BMI and pass our BMI to it. If we now save that code, the format import gets removed there because we're not using the format package anymore in this BMI.go file. And we now have a very lean BMI.go file in general. Only 19 lines of code, and that includes all those blank lines which are added for readability. That's not too bad. And with that, I'm quite happy with the BMI.go file. I'm happy with output.go, but I definitely want to revisit input.go and talk about getUserMetrics. Because whilst we also could leave this function as it is, it's definitely not super complex, we could also argue that this should be split up as well. And that's therefore the last thing I want to do in this course section, to dive even deeper into functions and gain more practice working with functions.